Hello and welcome to Fighting Through Writing, your journey into the weird and wonderful world of competitive sports fiction. My name is Paul. I'm a competitive sports fiction writer who, for over 15 years now, has been penning a living, interactive, real-time saga depicting the quest of our protagonist El Pablo to try and prove himself worthy of earning the right to be a part of his Mexican wrestling family's legacy. A legacy he's always been denied by his vengeful uncle Villano. Now, if you're familiar with my work or if you've been following along with these videos, you'll know that that quest currently finds us in the Extreme Wrestling Corporation, the most prominent professional wrestling company in this particular universe, a company that has just staged its Rumble for the Roses pay-per-view, the second pay-per-view of the year, and a pay-per-view that saw El Pablo not only defend the tag team championships with his brother Vertigo against his teammates, the Bloody Shuriazu, but also the undisputed championship against his best friend, Ace King. Now, if you're not familiar with all this, the Extreme Wrestling Corporation, or the EWC, is basically a pro wrestling role-playing / flash fiction writing competition hybrid that essentially pits the characters of real-life writers against one another in a series of fights across a series of shows as they each attempt to win championships or build legacies or just tell whatever kind of stories those writers want to tell. And yeah, this Rumble for the Roses show saw me charged with submitting not one but two separate assignments, which ultimately, through a combination of waiting for the results of shows in the build-up to this pay-per-view and general procrastination, led to me writing for nearly 24 hours non-stop. Now, obviously, that was not the plan. Even that week, I had it in my mind that I was going to get the first chapter done in advance and then just kind of breeze through the second one. But that is not how it went. I think I kind of just knew that I had that last day off from work. I was going to be at home anyway. So I kind of just thought, I've got the day. It'll be fine. It won't take that long. So yeah, started at 8:30, I think, that morning, and didn't end up finishing until I think it was about 2:30, or maybe I finished writing at about 2. But once I'd kind of proofread and actually submitted it and all that sort of stuff, it was 2:30. So a long time. And if you're wondering, was it worth it? You will have to wait and see at the end of the video. But before we get to that, I thought we could go through kind of what I submitted and the thought processes behind that and how I kind of tackled and balanced having these two separate but concurrent chapters to kind of weave together. And I did pretty early on make the decision that I wanted this to be kind of a two-part thing, which in a competition like this, it does kind of bring its own challenges. Like, you want to make sure that the individual pieces that you are submitting are relevant to that match that you are submitting them for. You want to make sure that you're, keeping it relevant rather than spreading everything out between the two, if that makes sense. Because there is ultimately a scorecard and a series of check marks and criteria that you have to hit in order to get the points from the judges that will ultimately lead to you hopefully winning that match, and in this case keeping those belts. So yeah, I decided I wanted this to be a two-part kind of story, mostly because it's quite a significant point within El Pablo's journey. I spoke in the last video, or possibly even the video before that, about how we felt like this was kind of the third act of this novel, or this novella that we've been telling, where Pablo he's finally found the key that he thinks is going to ultimately persuade his uncle Villano to consider him worthy of being a part of this family legacy, that being the undisputed championship, with the tag team championship also serving as a nice little bonus that can hopefully grant Vertigo that same honor as well. And so the reason why I was calling this being the third act is that it's kind of, I, as the writer have the decision to make now whether that mission succeeds and whether Viano is one round and lets them be a part of the family, or he remains stubborn and says, it doesn't matter, be gone with you, that kind of thing. And what also made this show extra special is that Pablo, as I said, is defending that Undisputed Championship against Ace King, who is his best friend in wrestling, and Geordie, the writer of the Ace King character, is legitimately someone who I started writing alongside when I very first got into this hobby, when this whole story started back in 2008. We've known each other a long old time, so for both of us now to be getting the opportunity to fight for the biggest prize in the industry is wild. It's just a really cool moment for the both of us, and I felt like I had to build both of these stories around that, not just the Ace King thing, but also the Undisputed Championship and this is kind of a sink or swim moment as far as that family legacy goes. So the way I planned it out was part 2 was going to be the chapter dedicated to the Undisputed Championship. Part 1 was going to kind of be build up to that and the groundwork laying for that, whilst also obviously being a bit more focused around the tag team championship defense against the Bloody Shuriazu, who also just so happened to be Pablo and Vertigo's stablemates in the Shinijoshi faction. So again, a very cool kind of moment for us to go against one another as well. But yeah, when it comes to planning out my writing, the first thing generally that I always kind of look for is a location to set it in, something that I can kind of tie to Pablo's current state of mind, or something to do with his opponents or the stipulation of the match, something like that. So this show was set in Pasadena, California, which turned out was a little more tricky to find stuff than I thought. Pasadena, it turns out, is just a lot of, oh hey, a famous person lived here, but also now a real non-famous human lives here, so you can't go inside. Or here's a tree that was in Back to the Future for a bit. So not a huge amount. And I know now that it's like minutes away from LA and all that sort of stuff, but I don't know, I liked the challenge of finding something a little more offbeat and a little, just trying to find something in or near Pasadena. I ultimately settled on the Heritage Square Museum, which I don't think, despite what I just said, is technically in Pasadena, but it's close enough. And the reasoning for that is I've always written Pablo as kind of this lovable goofball, and I figured in his head, what if he thought the Heritage Square Museum was literally a museum about old-fashioned historical squares, as it like actual shapes, and therefore was like, squares of a historical significance. This show is going to be historically significant because everything's coming full circle. Something dumb like that. I've mentioned before that my favorite thing about writing is kind of puns and wordplay, and kind of the more cheesy and tortured and cringeworthy, kind of the better. I think that kind of plays into Pablo's almost like, is it anti-humor? I feel like it not being funny is what makes it funny to me. So yeah, I thought that would be good. And then as I kind of looked through the site a bit more and kind of what was there's old-fashioned railway carriages, which kind of touched on his opponents coming into this match like a freight train because they haven't lost a match this season, and where he and his brother have kind of lost a couple of matches recently, their season is threatening to go off the rails. Real highbrow kind of stuff we're dealing with right here. So yeah, that was the thinking behind the location. And then to lead us into that, I basically gave us sort of a prologue, but more a carry on from the previous match that Pablo had where he lost a capture the flag ladder match kind of hybrid where basically there was an American flag and a Mexican flag hanging above the ring, and whoever out of he and his opponent was the first to pull down the opponent's flag won the match. Pablo lost, so we open in the immediate aftermath of that defeat with Pablo kind of lying in the ring under the Mexican flag, bemoaning the fact that he has essentially, in his own mind, not only lost the match, but also disgraced his country, and therefore pretty much guaranteed that Viano is never gonna let him into the family now. We then have his cousin Varana enter and basically say, look, you were never gonna get Viano's blessing. Like, he tried to kill you and buried you in the desert, so why on earth would you think that that would turn it round? And Pablo then points out that there was a moment in time a couple of years ago where Viano surprisingly saved him from the desert and kind of left him with this little memento of a poinsettia plant with the Volando family crest attached to it. And he says, surely that has to mean something. And Verona says, yeah, that he still has power over you. Like, this is clearly all a mind game just to try and throw you off and try and prevent you from achieving the success that you are capable of. And they have a bit of back and forth about it, and it basically ends with Pablo kind of just exploding into all this pent up kind of frustration and guilt, even at the fact that Varana and Vertigo kind of chose to separate themselves from Viano to join Pablo and to help Pablo out. And Pablo says, you guys could have been set by now. You could have had that legacy had you not followed me. And he says, I've always been brought up being told that the Volando family name is the only thing that matters and that I would never have it. Therefore, I don't matter. And he says, I finally thought that I'd found a family in the Shinajoshi that had chosen me and that wanted to celebrate my successes, only to find out that they now want to take everything away from me too, obviously meaning the tag titles. So that was the first scene. And then the scene immediately after that I staged in the second part of this. So I kind of alternated between the two because I was picturing this as kind of like a curve, I suppose. So this is kind of Pablo bottoming out and then needing to kind of accept this truth that he does matter, like regardless of whether he is part of that family name or not. He has achieved all of this stuff on his own merits. In, I guess, story writing terms, he needs to abandon the plot and embrace the theme, what ultimately is going to bring him forwards. But yeah, in terms of this particular chapter, we then cut to a few days later at the Heritage Square Museum, where it's just Varana and Vertigo. Vertigo is on the phone, presumably to Pablo, even though he doesn't speak. He is famously incredibly non-verbal, stubbornly non-verbal. And so Varana is trying to convince herself as much as anything that Pablo will turn up. He's done this many times before where he kind of crashes out, gets overwhelmed and takes himself off and ultimately swoops back in at the end, kind of ready to go, in a better frame of mind, I guess, at least. And that's where we talk about the full circle stuff, not only the Ace King stuff, but also the fact that this particular tag match is scheduled to be a ladder match, which was also the stipulation of the very first match that Pablo and Vertigo, the Silent Discotechnicos, had in the EWC. So there's that kind of synergy there. And then this is where we kind of just dive into the shoot part and the talking about the match and about the opponents and hyping up the Shuriazu as, they're undefeated. They've had more matches. We've had more wins than anybody else this season, whereas Pablo and Vertigo have been a bit more up and down. But she says, the Discotechnicos have rallied back from adversity before. They lost the tag titles right at the start of last season and went on to be undefeated for the entire rest of the year. Likewise, this season, again, lost the belts right at the start, but rallied back and won them back just a couple of months later. And she says, that's the thing that I think, more than anything, truly separates the Silent Discotechnicos from probably anybody else on the EWC roster. No matter how far you fall or however devastating the impediment, we always bounce back, which is where Pablo makes his timely reappearance. And he says, I'm really sorry. I really do appreciate the choices that you guys made. I just want so desperately to help us get that life that we've always been denied. Verona says that, we can discuss it later after you guys have walked out still tag team champions. And Pablo, newly confident in his absence, says, well, that's the easy part. He says, yes, the Shuriazu as a team have been flawless, but individually, Narumi and Aya have had their own fair share of unscheduled stoppages, because the train, Aya's lost almost as many times as some of the enhancement talent, and even Narumi, while she statistically has been one of the strongest competitors in the entire company so far, she has lost a couple of times in big matches, particularly at Stranglemania, the show that El Pablo became undisputed champion, where she lost her indie championship to another high-flying Lucha Libre-inspired wrestler in Gabriela Visconti. So the opportunity is there. And yeah, there's a bit more back and forth on that, and they basically... Pablo ends by saying, look, in a ladder match, it's as much about moments as it is about facts and figures. It's a lot more chaotic, and there's a lot more variables at play in a match like that. And on that front, there's nobody that can hold a candle to the Silent Discotechnicos. So yeah, that basically was part one. We had a word limit of 2,500 words with this one, which it's always tricky with that kind of limit in place to try and balance the character stuff and all that kind of thing. But I thought it was pretty good. I thought the emotional part of the first bit was really good, and I personally think I did quite a good job of tying it all back together at the end with Pablo's kind of reappearance. So yeah, a pretty solid effort, I thought. As for part two, this one I was really looking forward to writing. Obviously, with as much history as there is between Ace and El Pablo, there was plenty of opportunity for stuff to work with, and there was also no word limit at all in this one. So there was a lot more opportunity to kind of play around with multiple scenes and go a bit more in depth. And I did end up making it kind of almost like a little montage kind of thing. So we opened with a phone conversation between Pablo and his uncle Villano from back in October 2008, which is where Pablo won his very first World Championship in the first company that Geordie and I, Ace and El Pablo, first competed in, which was CZW. But yeah, it's basically Pablo rings Villano to say, look, I did it. So I was thinking, now that I'm like the best wrestler in the world or whatever, maybe I be a part of the family. How about that? And Villano basically just goes, oh, so you think you're better than me? Do you? Pablo's like, whoa, no, I didn't. That's not. You said you were the best wrestler in the world. Yeah, but I would just. So you're calling me a liar as well? That's, that whole kind of villainous manipulation kind of thing, and basically ends with Villano telling the younger Pablo that unless you're calling to tell me you've won a real world championship from a proper company, don't even bother. Don't darken these doors again. Hangs up the phone. That's when we cut to Pablo absolutely wailing the incredibly titled How Do You Know It's Not Armadillo Shells by Hot Mulligan in the passenger seat of a Suzuki Super Carry van driven by a guy named Carl. Now, Carl is not really a regular character, but he is the character who, when Pablo first started in the EWC, picked Pablo's half-dead body up from the side of the road after he'd been buried in the desert by Villano. So in keeping with the theme of kind of everything coming full circle, I wanted to bring that back. And it's also an opportunity for someone to be kind of the voice of reason, if you like, for El Pablo, to kind of help him see through the self-pitying and the kind of the despair that he's in the wake of losing that ladder match, and kind of seeing his dreams and his ambitions all kind of go up in smoke. So yeah, Pablo kind of catches Carl up on everything that's happened recently, with him kind of crashing out and going off on Verana and Vertigo, and just kind of basically saying, why am I still kind of seeking Viano's approval so desperately, kind of after everything that he's done to me, after all the kind of torture and everything that he put me through. And Carl says, I get it. It's like, not in the specifics, but he says, he always wanted to be an interior designer, but when he tried to get the qualifications, he ended up being paired with a teacher who just, for whatever reason, didn't like him, didn't kind of give him time of day, would always talk him down, would always kind of belittle him, be really hypercritical of everything that he did, which may or may not be loosely based on something from my own experience. And he says, ultimately he dropped out of school. He just ended up getting a whole load of soulless kind of 9-to-5 jobs and lost who he was, really. And he says, obviously he doesn't know what it's like to have your own family kind of turn on you and do that kind of stuff to you, but he knows what it's like to have your entire purpose and identity ripped away by someone who, was supposed to nurture it. And Pablo says, well, how did you get through it? And he says, well, I found his van, which he's turned into his own little kind of tiny home. And he says, this van gave me the opportunity to scratch that itch, and it wasn't for a piece of paper or for a qualification or anything like that. It was for me. And he says, anytime I'm in here, anytime I'm in this van, anytime I kind of look at this van, I know what I am. He says, that's what you need to do, Pablo. You need to find that why, the thing that recaptures what it was that made you want to do this in the first place, and to prove to yourself who you are, not to help you define what you want to be in the eyes of someone else. So yeah, that's the kind of sage wisdom part of it, I suppose. And we then cut to another little interlude, which I dug right back into the archives for, which was basically the first ever interaction that El Pablo and Ace King had in a creative writing kind of sense, which was January the 23rd, 2008. I did think about putting the full segment in there, but I felt a little bit uneasy about including someone else's writing in my work, even just as a reference to it. And I could have asked Geordie, and I know that Geordie wouldn't have minded in the slightest, but yeah, I kind of just decided to have it end with Pablo speaking to Ace and then just kind of cutting to static, just as a kind of, I still felt it kind of worked as a poignant kind of, it did what it needed to do, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. And we then cut to the main part of the piece, which takes place in between Pablo's car ride with Carl and him reuniting with Verana and Vertigo at the museum. And for this one, I set it in El Adobe Flores, which is a ranch house in South Pasadena. So it's one of the oldest buildings in South Pasadena, which obviously plays into how old Geordie and I are in this game. And it is also the place where I think the surrender or the peace treaty between Mexico and America was signed at the end of the Mexican-American War in 18 whatever. Again, kind of serving as a Mexican last stand, if you like, which again plays into this being kind of Pablo's last stand, I guess. So we'll start with that kind of setting the scene, and then Pablo just basically talking about how long the guys have known each other, how many days and weeks and months have passed, and the fact that they never thought they'd get to this point, but also how bizarre it is that for the amount of time that they have been in the EWC together, this is only the second time that they're actually going to compete against one another. So the first time was in a big multi-person ladder match. There's a lot of ladder matches in Pablo's history. At the end of 2017. And he says, there's people that have started in the company literally a couple of years ago that he's faced more times. But he says, ultimately that probably helped to make this feel even more special. And he then goes on to say, for as long as he's been there, Ace has been the guy, or certainly one of the guys. He's got the longest single championship reign in history. He's a multi-time undisputed champion. He's won pretty much everything there is to win. But he says, I think recently I've done a pretty good job of trying to rein that aura in. He's where Ace has got the longest championship reign, Pablo's got the second. Where Ace has got the most total days spent as champion, Pablo's got the second. And he says, since the start of 2021, Pablo has got one of the best records in this company. And he says, I know that you might be thinking that all this is kind of sounding like this match is like a changing of the guard sort of thing. And he says, well, if that is the case, it's only because Ace said it first. Which my big kind of framing going into this is that a lot of Ace's character stuff, certainly this season, has been kind of, I'm not getting any younger. I've only got so many matches left in me. I'm not as quick or as young or as I used to be, but I've got different skills now. And it's interesting because, as I say, El Pablo and Ace have been around for the same amount of time, but I've never really aged Pablo in that kind of sense, partly because in my own life I've been 26 for about 12 years at this point. But yeah, I don't know, I've just never really acknowledged the passing of time, I suppose, outside of the obvious things like talking about the history between two wrestlers. But I just thought that was an interesting kind of dichotomy that we can pitch between the two of them, and it kind of lent into more of what we were focusing on here, where that mindset might ultimately be what makes the difference. Where if Ace is feeling his age and feeling the kind of the grizzled part of being a grizzled veteran, then Pablo's effervescence will kind of help him keep at it potentially a little bit longer and a little bit better. And he says, when that bell rings, I'm all about the moment, and on July 21st I will have my moment. He then goes on to say, look, we've spent so much time in each other's company over the years. We've been tag team champions in various companies, so we know that in theory there aren't going to be any surprises, particularly when this match is being contested under pure rules, which basically is the exact opposite of what the ladder match in the other fight we were talking about was, where there is no room for kind of chaos and weapons based violence and all that kind of stuff. It's very down the middle, and certainly plays a lot more into Ace's kind of methodical, strategic kind of thinking, a lot more than Pablo's kind of gung-ho, wild and crazy luchador kind of offense. There's also the fact that Ace started the year as Dynasty champion, which was contested under pure rules, so he's got that experience right there. But Pablo says, in having forged such a legacy within the X division and within the more hardcore, stipulation heavy kind of wrestling, he has had to be adaptable consistently. So what better way to demonstrate that adaptability than by winning a pure rules match? And we end by saying, basically, the fact that there can be no surprises actually plays into Pablo's hands more, because Ace, more than anybody, knows exactly what Pablo has been through. He knows the hardship and the struggles that Pablo has faced at the expense of Villano. He knows what Pablo has sacrificed to get to this point and what it potentially will mean if Pablo succeeds in this match. And he says, 17 years ago when we first met, I had no idea who I was. But in 4 days, everyone is going to know who the better man of this bona fide dream match is. Everyone is going to know who is going to continue to carry this company on his back. His name is El Pablo, and he is the EWC Undisputed Champion. And that was it. That was 17 hours of blood, sweat, and coffee poured into this 2-part saga. I'm not going to lie, as a writing strategy, I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it, and I fully recognize that I didn't help myself in any way, shape or form by writing it all on my phone. Like, I have a laptop, but for whatever reason, whenever I've tried to just sit here at this desk on my laptop and write, I just can't focus. My brain just doesn't let me. That's why I kind of have stopped doing kind of write with me kind of videos, because it just doesn't work for me. I find myself much better kind of just dipping in and out. It's like that episode of The Big Bang Theory where Sheldon's trying to figure out this scientific formula that he's having trouble with by facing away from his whiteboard and just kind of, you know, fleeting glimpses of it. I feel like that's kind of how I write best, just kind of sitting there with Google Docs open on my phone in the background and then just kind of dipping in and out kind of as little pockets of ideas come. I'm also a very linear writer, so I kind of have to start at the start and then kind of just see how the words fall on the page. I'll have the odd kind of bullet point or sentence in mind here and there, but it's usually very organic, just seeing what comes to mind. I feel like that helps with it all sounding kind of natural, I think, particularly in terms of dialogue. I know a lot of people that struggle with kind of writing realistic dialogue, and while I can't vouch for how realistic my dialogue is, I certainly don't feel like I've ever struggled to write it. And I think that's possibly because, writing front to back kind of just, it means it is always kind of flowing organically, and I'm just kind of framing everything around it, if that makes sense. But yeah, the end of the second one definitely became a bit of a struggle once it got past midnight, and I'd exhausted all brain power at that point and was just kind of a need to just force it through a little bit to the end. But it was a fun experience all the same. Like, as draining as it was and as taxing as it was so much fun to be able to tell this part of the story, and loved writing against my Shinajoshi siblings, loved writing against Geordie. Now, as to whether it was all worth it, yes, but also no. So the Silent Disco Technicos lost the tag team championships at the start of the night, and I think that might be the end of that particular chapter. Like, the last couple of bits of feedback that I've got haven't been as positive as I would like them to be. And while I certainly could just, keep at it and keep trying to mold that story and kind of get a bit more comfortable with particularly the Vertigo character and the unique kind of challenges of writing that, I also feel like I've won the tag team titles 4 times now and have successfully defended them once across the whole thing. So I think that's a pretty sure sign that maybe tag team wrestling is not for El Pablo. There's also now the thinking in my mind that at least it means that I can focus on his continuing journey as still the EWC Undisputed Champion. We beat Ace King in a match that I believe, or I heard on the grapevine, might be one of the most closely contested fights that the company's had in a long old time. So I got awarded the show MVP for Rumble of the Roses, which essentially means you got the highest scoring bit of writing out of everyone who submitted something for the show, which was great. We also got Match of the Night, which means that Geordie also submitted a very high scoring piece with not a lot between the two of us, which I guess is as sure a sign as any that effort that I put in really did pay off, certainly for part 2. But yeah, I think that will do it. This video also feels like it's been going on for about 24 hours. As always, I will leave WordPress links in the description if you want to go and read both of these yourself. I would absolutely encourage you to do so. Please let me know what you think about them as well, either in the comments here or over on the WordPress site. I'd love to see you over there. Please like this video, share, subscribe to the channel and all the rest of that stuff. And yeah, we've got a couple more assignments already in the calendar. So in 2 weeks time, El Pablo faces his longtime rival, the woman who once tried to stab him in the heart with a broken light tube, Queen Melody Malone. And then at the end of August, El Pablo once again defends his undisputed championship against either Amish Shelton, the man who just defeated him in that aforementioned flag match, ladder match thing, or the new current reigning co-tag team champion, his Shinijoshi stablemate Narumi Sutsumi. So plenty more fun and games to be had. Hopefully a little more sleep to be had, but I make no promises on either. Either way, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you next time on Fighting Through Writing.